Sheriff Buck Maxwell, a man more accustomed to flashing blue lights and the urgent squeal of police radios than the gentle rustle of suburban newsletters, arrived home on Tuesday evening, the weight of a long day pressing down on his shoulders. He'd spent the morning mediating a dispute between feuding hog farmers, the afternoon chasing down a teenager joyriding on a stolen tractor, and the early evening presiding over a surprisingly heated town hall meeting about leash laws. He was ready for quiet, for a cold drink, for the comforting predictability of his own home. As he pulled into his driveway, however, any hope for tranquility evaporated like morning mist in the midday sun. Affixed to his mailbox with the cheerful yet somehow menacing insistence of bright yellow adhesive, was a notice. Not an advertisement, not a friendly neighborhood flyer, but a stiff, professionally printed paper that screamed bureaucratic officiousness. A violation notice from the Pleasant Valley Homeowners Association. Buck, a man who understood the gravity of official documents, felt a flicker of unease. He approached cautiously as if the yellow paper might bite. Emblazoned across the top in a disturbingly friendly font was the HOA's logo, a stylized depiction of perfectly symmetrical houses nestled under an impossibly round sun, followed by the stark declaration, "Notice of violation." He peeled the notice from his mailbox, the adhesive surprisingly strong, like the HOA was determined this message would not be missed or ignored. The violation, according to the precisely worded text, was Section 4.2b, Mailbox Aesthetic Noncompliance. Buck's brow furrowed. Aesthetic noncompliance? With his mailbox? He reread the clause, his eyes scanning the densely packed paragraph beneath. Your mailbox has been deemed to be visually discordant with the unified aesthetic standards rigorously maintained within the Pleasant Valley community. Specifically, the current presentation of your mailbox fails to align with the pre-approved palette of muted earth tone hues and lacks the requisite understated elegance mandated for all residential mail receptacles. Buck stared at his mailbox. It was green. Dark green. The same dark green as every other mailbox on Pleasant Valley Drive. The numbers were white, blocky and clear, precisely to code, easy for emergency services to read, a detail Buck in his professional capacity appreciated. He ran a hand over the smooth, slightly weathered paint. It was a perfectly ordinary, functional, law-abiding mailbox. Attached to the notice, clipped with a tiny plastic clothespin, was a photograph. A color print, slightly grainy, of his mailbox. Aggressively circled in what looked like a child's bright red marker were nothing. Absolutely nothing. The red circle encompassed the entire mailbox as if to say, this whole thing is the problem. Beneath the photograph, the warning was even more pointed. Rectify this violation within 72 hours. Failure to comply will result in an immediate fine of $150, and may precipitate further punitive measures as delineated in HOA Bylaw 7.8. Including but not limited to escalated fines, suspension of community privileges and potential legal action. Legal action? Over a mailbox? Buck scoffed, a dry, humorless sound. This was beyond ridiculous. This was bordering on aggressive. He glanced around Pleasant Valley Drive. Manicured lawns, identical hedges, houses in varying shades of beige and gray. The very picture of suburban conformity. He'd chosen this place for its quiet streets and proximity to the county line, not for some step-for-desk ideal of visual homogeneity. As he turned towards his house, something caught his eye. A flash of yellow on Mrs. Gable's pristine white mailbox next door. And another, fainter yellow, across the street on Mr. Henderson's. He walked closer to Mrs. Gable's mailbox, confirming his suspicion. Another yellow notice, identical to his own. He scanned down the street. Yellow was blooming on mailboxes up and down Pleasant Valley Drive like some bizarre, unwelcome spring. This wasn't targeted. This was a purge. A mailbox massacre. And he knew, with the certainty of a seasoned lawman recognizing a pattern, exactly who was behind it. Karen from number 12. The self-appointed guardian of Pleasant Valley's aesthetic soul. He crumpled the yellow notice in his fist, the paper crackling like dry leaves. The initial amusement replaced by a simmering, distinctly unsheriff-like annoyance. He'd dealt with hardened criminals with more reasonable demands than mailbox aesthetic compliance. He knew Karen. He knew her perfectly sculpted eyebrows and her perfectly weaponized passive aggression. He'd had minor skirmishes before, the rose bushes deemed too unruly, the truck parked inconsiderately. But this was an escalation. This was an act of open suburban warfare. He walked into his house, the yellow paper a crumpled accusation in his hand, a plan already forming in his mind. He wouldn't just rectify this ridiculous violation. He would investigate. He would uncover the motive behind this mailbox madness. Anne Karen, in her perfectly beige house at number 12, was about to learn that messing with a county sheriff, even over something as trivial as a mailbox, had consequences. He tossed the crumpled yellow notice onto his kitchen island, the bright color a jarring intrusion into his otherwise ordered life. He was about to make a call to the HOA to introduce himself officially when he heard the distinct crunch of tires on his gravel driveway. A car door slammed. And then footsteps, purposeful and brisk, approaching his front door. He moved to the window, peering through the blinds. A woman, sharp blazer, clipboard in hand, face set in a determined, official expression. Buck didn't need to see a badge to know. The HOA was escalating and fast. The mailbox saga was just beginning, and Pleasant Valley was about to become a lot less pleasant indeed.
The woman at the door, clipboard in hand, introduced herself as Miss Sternwood, Pleasant Valley HOA's official compliance officer. Her blazer was impeccably tailored, her demeanor briskly professional, and her voice held the practiced neutrality of someone accustomed to delivering bad news with a veneer of pleasant efficiency. She didn't smile, not even a polite, perfunctory one. She simply stated her purpose. She was there to conduct a formal inspection of Sheriff Maxwell's mailbox, regarding the cited violation. Buck, still in his shirt sleeves from his day's duties, raised an eyebrow, inviting her in with a gesture. Miss Sternwood, however, remained firmly planted on his porch, as if crossing the threshold into Sheriff Maxwell's home would somehow compromise her official stance. She requested he accompany her to the mailbox. Buck, suppressing a sigh, obliged, stepping out onto his porch and leading Miss Sternwood the 10 feet to the offending receptacle. Miss Sternwood approached the mailbox with the solemnity of an art critic examining a potentially flawed masterpiece. She circled it slowly, her eyes narrowed, clipboard held at a precise 45-degree angle. She consulted the yellow notice attached to her clipboard, comparing the photograph to the actual mailbox as if searching for discrepancies visible only to the trained eye. She tapped the mailbox with a pen, the sound echoing in the otherwise quiet suburban afternoon. She peered at the numbers, ran a finger along the trim, and even bent down to examine the base, as if expecting to find hidden subversive elements lurking beneath the surface. Buck watched this performance with a mixture of amusement and growing irritation. It was theater, pure and simple, and not particularly well-acted theater at that. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of silent scrutiny, Miss Sternwood straightened up, cleared her throat, and addressed Buck, her voice still professionally neutral, yet with a faint undercurrent of something else. Triumph? Perhaps even glee? Sheriff Maxwell, she began, the title delivered with a carefully calibrated degree of respect that somehow managed to sound vaguely condescending. I have conducted my inspection. And I must concur with the initial assessment. Your mailbox does indeed exhibit significant aesthetic non-compliance. Buck resisted the urge to point out the absurdity of the statement. He remained outwardly calm, sheriff face firmly in place. Miss Sternwood, he replied, his voice even and measured. With all due respect, could you perhaps elaborate on exactly what constitutes this aesthetic non-compliance? To my admittedly untrained eye, it appears to be a standard mailbox, regulation size, regulation color, regulation everything. Miss Sternwood consulted her clipboard again, as if searching for the precise bureaucratic phrasing to justify the unjustifiable. Section 4.2b, she recited, stipulates adherence to the Pleasant Valley Unified Aesthetic Doctrine, which prioritizes muted, earth-tone palettes and understated elegance. While your mailbox is green, she conceded as if admitting a distasteful truth, it is too green. The shade, according to the pre-approved color swatches, swatch 3B, Suburban Serenity Beige, and swatch 5D, Whispering Willow Gray, is discordant. Furthermore, she continued, warming to her task, the texture of the paint appears to lack the requisite matte finish. It possesses a slight sheen, which, again, detracts from the overall harmonious visual landscape of Pleasant Valley. Buck blinked, genuinely speechless for a moment. He'd faced down armed robbers, calmed hysterical witnesses, and negotiated with hostage-takers, but he was utterly unprepared for this level of suburban absurdity. He managed to maintain his composure. Miss Sternwood, he said, his voice still calm, but with a definite edge creeping in. Are you seriously telling me that my mailbox is in violation because the shade of green is not to HOA specifications and because it's slightly too shiny? Miss Sternwood's neutral facade finally cracked, replaced by a thin, tight smile. Sheriff Maxwell, she said, leaning in slightly as if sharing a confidential secret, these standards are not arbitrary. They are meticulously crafted to maintain property values and ensure the equality of life within Pleasant Valley. And, she added, her voice dropping even further, almost conspiratorially, these concerns were brought to our attention by a concerned resident, who feels very strongly about upholding these standards. The unspoken name hung in the air, heavy and yellow notice-colored. Karen. Buck knew it. He knew it was Karen from the moment he saw the yellow paper. But Miss Sternwood's veiled reference confirmed it. Karen wasn't just complaining, she was wielding influence, pulling strings within the HOA, weaponizing suburban bylaws against her neighbors. He looked at Miss Sternwood, really looked at her, beyond the blazer and the clipboard and the carefully constructed official persona. He saw not just a compliance officer, but a cog in a machine, a messenger carrying Karen's petty grievances like official pronouncements. He felt a shift within him from annoyance to something sharper, something more sheriff-like. This wasn't just about a mailbox anymore. This was about abuse of power, about petty tyranny disguised as suburban orderliness. And Sheriff Buck Maxwell did not tolerate tyranny, petty or otherwise. He straightened his back, his gaze hardening. Miss Sternwood, he said, his voice now carrying the unmistakable authority of law enforcement, thank you for your thorough inspection. I understand the concerns that have been raised. I assure you I will be looking into this matter further. Miss Sternwood, perhaps sensing the change in tone, the shift in power dynamics, finally offered a flicker of a genuine, albeit nervous, smile. Very good, Sheriff, she said, stepping back slightly. We appreciate your cooperation. She turned and walked back towards her car, clipboard clutched tightly, leaving Buck standing on his porch, staring at his perfectly ordinary, now officially non-compliant, mailbox. He knew one thing for certain. This was far from over. Karen had escalated. Now it was his turn. And Sheriff Buck Maxwell had a feeling that Pleasant Valley was about to experience a whole different kind of compliance. The kind enforced by the long arm of the law. He had a sheriff's badge, a mandate to uphold justice, and a suddenly very personal reason to investigate the inner workings of the Pleasant Valley Homeowners Association. Karen and her perfectly beige world had just made a very big mistake. Sheriff Buck Maxwell, standing on his porch, the non-compliant mailbox looming innocently nearby, felt a slow burn of righteous indignation replacing his initial amusement. This wasn't just about a ridiculous yellow notice or a clipboard-wielding HOA official. This was about Karen weaponizing the mundane machinery of suburban governance to exert control and inflict petty grievances. And now, with Miss Sternwood's visit, it was clear Karen's influence within the Pleasant Valley HOA was significant, potentially even insidious. He decided it was time to stop being merely amused and start being proactive. He went inside not to repaint his mailbox beige but to make some calls. First, a call to county dispatch. He needed to subtly inquire about any unusual requests for service coming from the Pleasant Valley area, specifically related to mailbox aesthetics. The dispatcher, a laconic veteran named Rodriguez, initially chuckled, thinking Buck was pulling his leg. But when Buck pressed, explaining the situation with carefully chosen words, "Just checking on neighborhood disputes, keeping an ear to the ground, you know how it is," Rodriguez agreed to keep an eye out, muttering something about suburbanites and their dramas. Next, Buck dialed a less official number. His neighbor, Mr. Henderson, the recipient of his own yellow notice. Mr. Henderson, a retired accountant with a penchant for neighborhood gossip, answered on the second ring. Buck, after some carefully casual preamble about the weather and the recent town hall meeting, steered the conversation towards the HOA and specifically the mailbox notices. Mr. Henderson, it turned out, was incandescent with rage. He'd lived in Pleasant Valley for 20 years, meticulously maintained his property, and never had a single complaint. Now, suddenly his perfectly acceptable mailbox was an aesthetic affront? And he too suspected Karen. It's always Karen, Buck, always, Mr. Henderson fumed, his voice rising in pitch. She called the cops on Mrs. Davison last year because her Halloween decorations were premature. Premature. It was October 1st. The Halloween decoration incident. Buck remembered vaguely hearing whispers about that, dismissed at the time as suburban folklore. But now, coupled with the mailbox notices, a pattern was emerging. Karen wasn't just aesthetically discerning, she was actively policing Pleasant Valley's conformity, and seemingly leveraging any means necessary to do it. As Buck hung up with Mr. Henderson, Rodriguez from dispatch called back, his tone now less amused, more concerned. "Sheriff," Rodriguez said, his voice dropping slightly, "you might want to sit down for this. We just got a call. Pleasant Valley HOA. Requesting police assistance. Mailbox violation." Buck almost choked. "Mailbox violation?" he repeated, incredulous. "They're calling for police, for a mailbox?" "Apparently," Rodriguez sighed, "the caller, name of Karen something, claims the homeowner is uncooperative, potentially belligerent, and obstructing HOA enforcement. Says they fear for escalation." Buck couldn't believe it. Karen had actually called the cops. On him. Sheriff Buck Maxwell. For a mailbox. The sheer audacity of it was almost impressive, in a warped, suburban tyranny kind of way. He felt a surge of something. Not anger, not exactly. More like a potent mix of disbelief, simmering outrage, and a dawning sense of grim amusement. This had gone beyond petty. Karen had crossed a line. She'd not only tried to impose her ridiculous aesthetic standards, she'd attempted to weaponize law enforcement against her neighbor. A neighbor who happened to be the law enforcement. "Rodriguez," Buck said, his voice now calm and firm, the sheriff back in full command. "Who's responding to that call?" "Unit 42, Rodriguez replied. "That's Deputy Miller. Young guy. Eager." "Intercept Deputy Miller," Buck instructed, his mind already racing. "Tell him to hold back. Tell him Sheriff Maxwell will handle this Pleasant Valley situation personally." 10-4 Sheriff, Rodriguez said, a hint of excitement now in his voice. "Dispatching that now." "Sounds interesting, Sheriff." Interesting was an understatement. Buck walked back out onto his porch, the yellow notice fluttering mockingly in the gentle breeze. He straightened his sheriff's badge, which he'd instinctively put on when Rodriguez called, a reflex honed by years of responding to calls for service, no matter how bizarre. He saw headlights approaching, a county sheriff's cruiser turning onto Pleasant Valley Drive. Deputy Miller, no doubt, eager to answer the call, completely unaware he was about to walk into the suburban equivalent of a Wild West showdown. Buck smiled, a slow sheriff-esque smile. Karen wanted to play hardball? Fine. Sheriff Buck Maxwell knew how to play hardball. And he had a badge, a jurisdiction, and a suddenly very personal vendetta against aesthetically obsessed suburban tyranny. The cruiser pulled up to the curb. Deputy Miller, looking young and slightly confused, stepped out. And Sheriff Buck Maxwell, county sheriff, was ready to greet him, ready to introduce himself, and ready to finally bring this ridiculous mailbox melodrama to a head. Pleasant Valley was about to learn that calling the cops on the sheriff might not be the best move Karen could have made. Deputy Miller, fresh-faced and eager to please, approached Sheriff Maxwell's porch with a mixture of professional seriousness and youthful curiosity. He hadn't been on patrol long, and a call directly from the Pleasant Valley HOA was a first. He certainly hadn't expected to be met by Sheriff Maxwell himself, standing on the porch in his uniform shirt, badge gleaming faintly in the late afternoon sun. "Deputy Miller, Sheriff Maxwell," Buck said, extending a hand in greeting. Miller, momentarily stunned to be shaking hands with the sheriff at a routine HOA call, snapped to attention and returned the handshake with a firm grip. "Sheriff, dispatch said there was a situation here?" "HOA call?" he stammered, glancing around, expecting to see some kind of disturbance, perhaps a loud party or a barking dog. All he saw was a perfectly ordinary suburban street, quiet as could be, and a very average-looking mailbox. Buck nodded calmly. "That's right, Deputy. A situation, of sorts. Pleasant Valley Homeowners Association called it in. Mailbox violation." Miller blinked, confusion deepening. "Mailbox violation, Sheriff? That's a police matter?" Buck suppressed a wry smile. "Apparently in Pleasant Valley, Deputy, mailbox aesthetics are a matter of grave public concern. And," Buck added, lowering his voice slightly, "it seems the complainant felt threatened enough to require police intervention." He let the word threatened hang in the air, heavy with sarcasm. Miller's eyes widened slightly as he started to grasp the absurdity of the situation. "So, the violation is your mailbox, Sheriff?" he asked, gesturing tentatively towards the offending green receptacle. Buck nodded again. "Exhibit A, Deputy. Apparently it's the wrong shade of green and possibly too shiny. A clear and present danger to the harmonious visual landscape of Pleasant Valley." Miller finally allowed himself a small, incredulous chuckle. "Sheriff, with all due respect, it looks like a mailbox." "Precisely, Deputy," Buck agreed. And that, it seems, is the problem. Now, Deputy Miller, Buck continued, shifting to a more serious tone, the complainant on this call is a resident named Karen Henderson. Lives at number 12. I want you to understand something. We are not here to enforce HOA bylaws regarding mailbox color. We are here to ensure public safety and to address any legitimate concerns. In this case, Buck emphasized, I suspect the concern is, shall we say, exaggerated. He paused, then added, however, since a call for police assistance was made, we need to address it, diplomatically. I'm going to handle the interaction with Ms. Henderson. I want you to observe and be ready to de-escalate, should the aesthetic non-compliance situation become overly heated. Miller nodded, now fully understanding this was less about law enforcement and more about suburban social dynamics. Buck led the way down Pleasant Valley Drive towards number 12, a meticulously landscaped beige house that practically screamed HOA compliance. As they approached, the front door swung open, and Karen Henderson emerged, stage right, as if perfectly timed for her dramatic entrance. She was dressed in impeccably pressed gardening clothes, her perfectly coiffed hair glinting in the sun, and her face set in a mask of righteous indignation. Officer! Karen exclaimed, spotting Deputy Miller and completely ignoring Sheriff Maxwell, whom she clearly hadn't recognized out of uniform. Thank goodness you're here. This scofflaw at number 8 is refusing to comply with a valid HOA violation. He's being difficult. And I fear, she lowered her voice dramatically, he might become aggressive. Deputy Miller, still slightly flustered but playing along, started to speak, but Buck stepped forward, smoothly inserting himself into the conversation. Ms. Henderson, Buck said, his voice calm and authoritative, Sheriff Buck Maxwell, County Sheriff. I understand you placed a call regarding a mailbox situation? Karen stopped mid-rant, her eyes widening as she finally registered who she was addressing. Her perfectly sculpted eyebrows shot up in surprise, then narrowed into suspicion. Sheriff Maxwell, she repeated as if the words tasted unpleasant. You're him? The homeowner at number 8? Buck nodded, maintaining his calm sheriff persona. Guilty as charged, Miss Henderson. And yes, I believe you have concerns about my mailbox. Karen recovered quickly, her indignation reigniting. Concerns? Sheriff, this is about upholding community standards. About property values. About the very fabric of Pleasant Valley. Your mailbox is in blatant violation. Ms. Sternwood from the HOA has already confirmed it. The wrong green. And it's shiny? Buck resisted the urge to roll his eyes. Ms. Henderson, he said, his voice firm but still even, I understand the HOA has sent me a notice and Ms. Sternwood has conducted an inspection. However, he paused, letting his sheriff's authority sink in, I also understand that calling the police over a mailbox color is perhaps an overreaction. Especially considering that I am the sheriff of this county. Karen sputtered, momentarily speechless. But, the violation. The fine. You're supposed to be fined $150 if you don't comply. The fine. It finally made its grand entrance. Buck nodded slowly. Yes, Miss Henderson, the yellow notice did mention a fine. And he reached into his pocket, pulling out a crisp $100 bill and a $50 bill, holding them out to her, to avoid any further escalation, and to demonstrate my commitment to community harmony. I will pay the fine. Right here, right now. Karen stared at the money, then at Buck, then back at the money, utterly flustered. But, it's not about the money. It's about principle, she stammered, the wind visibly taken out of her sails. Buck maintained his sheriff calm. Miss Henderson, I assure you I understand the OI principle. The principle of not calling the police over trivial matters. The principle of neighborly consideration. And the principle of perhaps focusing on slightly more pressing law enforcement concerns than mailbox paint sheen. He gently placed the $150 on the perfectly manicured porch railing. Consider the fine paid, Miss Henderson. And consider this matter closed. He nodded curtly to Karen, then turned to Deputy Miller. Deputy, all clear here. False alarm. Just a mailbox disagreement. Let's get back on patrol. As they walked back towards the cruiser, Deputy Miller couldn't contain his grin. Sheriff, he said, shaking his head in amusement, I can't believe she called us for that. And you just paid the fine? Even though it's ridiculous? Buck chuckled, a low rumble in his chest. Deputy, sometimes the easiest way to enforce the law is to subtly demonstrate its absurdity. And sometimes, he added with a wink, it's just cheaper than repainting your mailbox beige. He paused, then added, more seriously, but deputy, remember this call. Remember Karen Henderson. Because people like her, people who try to weaponize authority for petty grievances, they exist everywhere. And sometimes upholding the law means knowing when not to enforce the letter of it, but to uphold the spirit of it. Which is, not wasting police resources on mailbox colors. As they drove away, leaving a bewildered and speechless Karen Henderson standing on her perfectly manicured lawn, Buck glanced back at his non-compliant mailbox, still resolutely green, still slightly shiny, still perfectly ordinary. He smiled. Suburban peace, or at least a temporary truce, had been restored. And Sheriff Buck Maxwell had learned a valuable lesson. In Pleasant Valley, even the county sheriff wasn't immune to the long arm of HOA aesthetic tyranny, but he could outsmart it, outsheriff it, and definitely outpay it $150 at a time. And that, he thought, was a principle worth upholding. Loved Sheriff Buck's clever handling of the HOA Karen? Want to see more of his suburban law enforcement adventures? Let us know in the comments if you'd like more Sheriff Buck stories and what kind of neighborhood mysteries he should tackle next.